When the camp was down to its last morsels, one cowboy's secret recipe turned a single rabbit into a feast that would sustain a whole crew through the bitter night. But the true ingredients weren't just in the pot, they were in the cowboy's soul. Before we dive into this hearty tale, let us know where you're watching from, and if you've got your own frontier survival tips, give us a nod by subscribing for more rugged stories from the Wild West. The wind howled across the open plains, biting at the faces of the men huddled around the campfire. The fire crackled weakly, fighting against the deepening cold of the early winter evening. The sun, a dim shadow on the horizon, was setting behind the jagged hills, casting long, stretched-out shadows that crept slowly across the land. Dust swirled in the air as if the prairie itself was restless. For days the men had been running low on food. The supplies they had brought were down to the last scraps, and the rabbits and game they'd hoped to catch had been scarce. A harsh reality was settling in. The days had been long, the nights colder, and the land unforgiving. But then, from the dust of the horizon, a lone rider appeared. His horse, a sturdy creature that had weathered as many storms as its rider, moved steadily toward the camp. The rider's face was hidden beneath the brim of his wide hat, but his posture was unshaken, as though he knew exactly what he was doing. The men looked up, some of them raising tired heads from their hands, others not even bothering to lift their eyes, used to the fleeting hope that someone might bring good news. It was Solomon Kane. The men had known him for years. He wasn't the loudest, nor the quickest, but he was steady. A man of few words, but when he spoke, it was with purpose. His reputation for surviving when others couldn't preceded him, even if his methods were unconventional. Most of the camp didn't share his cautious, methodical way of doing things. They would have called it foolishness if they weren't so desperate for the simple comforts of a full belly. They thought he would have left by now, just like the rest. But here he was, returning to camp with something they hadn't seen in days. A catch. He rode in, dismounted with practiced grace, and without a word reached down to his belt. There, hanging from the leather, was a rabbit, its fur still fresh. A single rabbit, a small one. The men exchanged looks, not sure whether to be relieved or disappointed. One rabbit. Could it really feed the whole camp? Solomon didn't wait for questions. He went straight to the fire and set up a small pot over the embers. His movements were deliberate, precise. The men watched in silence as he worked, his hands steady and sure, even in the fading light. As he prepared the rabbit, cutting it with practiced strokes, some of the men began to gather closer. They were hungry, and something in Solomon's demeanor told them this was no ordinary meal. When the fire flickered brighter and the stew began to bubble, they could smell it, a rich, hearty scent, one that promised warmth and sustenance. It wasn't just the meat that caught their attention, but something else. Something about the way Solomon worked, something about the quiet confidence in his actions made them pause. This wasn't just a man preparing a meal. It was a man who had lived through too many winters to take survival for granted. The men gathered quietly around the fire, their eyes fixed on the bubbling pot as Solomon stirred it with methodical precision. The wind howled over the camp, the cold creeping into their bones, despite the warmth of the fire. But as the stew began to take shape, something changed. The aroma, rich and earthy, spread across the camp. The hunger that had gnawed at their stomachs began to ease, if only slightly. It wasn't just the promise of food. It was the unspoken understanding that something deeper was happening here. The rabbit was cooking, but Solomon added more to the pot than just meat. Herbs, roots, and a handful of dried plants that none of the men had noticed before. They weren't just for flavor. Solomon knew the land, knew it better than most, and he had spent years studying its secrets. He knew which plants would bring out the best in a meal and which could sustain the body longer than others. There was a purpose in every ingredient, even if no one else could see it. As the stew simmered, the men began to exchange looks. They were skeptical at first, unsure of what to expect from this single rabbit. Some of them had been ranchers, some of them miners, and others cowhands. Not a one had ever met a cowboy quite like Solomon. His reputation for surviving the hardest winters had earned him respect, But his methods, his strange, calculated ways, had often earned him ridicule. They had seen the way he worked, the way he took his time with everything, no matter how small. They had laughed behind his back. When he spent hours setting up his camp, carefully placing his firewood just so, taking notes about the weather, and building his shelter to withstand the harshest conditions. Yet here they were, watching him cook with the same deliberate precision. A single rabbit was enough to feed them all? It didn't seem possible, but the way Solomon worked made them believe. It wasn't just about the food. It was the confidence he exuded, the way he had always known how to do things the right way, even if it meant taking longer, even if it meant doing things that others thought unnecessary. One of the younger men, still full of youthful impatience, couldn't hold back his curiosity. "How do you do it, Solomon?" he asked, his voice barely rising above the crackling fire. "How do you know it's going to be enough?" Solomon didn't immediately respond. Instead, he reached for his knife and sliced the last of the rabbit into even pieces. His eyes met the young man's, steady and calm. "You don't just cook for today," he said, his voice low but carrying in the stillness of the night. "You cook for tomorrow too, and for the days after that." The others nodded, though they didn't fully understand. But as the stew began to take shape, as the flavors melded together, something in them shifted. The hunger began to ease, and for the first time in days, there was a sense of relief. Maybe, just maybe, Solomon knew something they didn't. As the men sat back, their bellies full and warmth spreading through their bodies, the silence around the fire deepened. The stew had worked its magic more than just nourishing their bodies. It had settled the restless tension that had been building among them for days. The hunger, the fear, the uncertainty, all of it had been momentarily quelled. Solomon sat apart from the others, his eyes fixed on the fire as he stirred his own bowl of stew. He didn't say much, not when he didn't have to, but the weight of his silence held more meaning than any words he could have spoken. They were a rough bunch. Men who had seen more than their share of hardship. They knew what it was like to go hungry, to fight for what little they had, and to watch friends and strangers alike fall to the unforgiving landscape. But Solomon had always been different. He wasn't quick to boast or show off. He wasn't the fastest to draw or the first to speak, but when it came to surviving, there was no man who knew more. And that was why they followed him, because he understood the land, understood its rhythms and harsh lessons in a way they didn't. One of the men, a grizzled older cowhand named Jack, broke the silence. He was sitting across from Solomon, his face hidden beneath a thick salt and pepper beard. He cleared his throat before speaking, his voice rough, yet full of genuine curiosity. "You know, Solomon, we've all seen our fair share of winters out here. You don't get to be old and still in the saddle without learning a thing or two about how to make it through. But what I've always wondered is how you do it. You don't rush. You don't panic like the rest of us do. You just—" Jack paused, looking around the fire at the others. "You just know." Solomon didn't meet his eyes immediately, instead letting the words settle between them. He took a slow, deliberate sip from his bowl before setting it down and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "It's not about rushing, Jack. It's about building, slow and steady. You can't expect the land to give you anything you don't earn. You don't just survive by luck." Solomon's voice was low but firm. "You survive by respecting it, understanding it. If you build for today, you won't make it tomorrow." Jack nodded, his furrowed brow showing that he understood more than he let on. The rest of the men, too, listened with quiet reverence. They had seen it time and time again. Solomon's patience was his greatest strength. His calm in the face of adversity was a lesson they had all come to respect, even if they couldn't fully grasp it. "You live by the land, not just on it," Solomon continued, his voice a steady whisper against the wind. "The land doesn't care about your pride, doesn't care about your speed. It only cares if you're prepared." The wind howled louder then, but it didn't seem to bother the men. It was a lesson they'd heard before, but tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt like something they could carry with them. The fire had burned down to embers by the time the stew was finished, the heat of the flames flickering across the men's faces. They sat in silence, the heavy weight of their hunger now replaced by something deeper, something that couldn't be seen but was felt all the same. The warmth in their bellies had spread to their hearts, filling the empty spaces with something more than just food. It was strange, the way Solomon worked. Strange the way he built the stew from so little, from the single rabbit that now lay reduced to a few tender bites, and yet no one could deny the fullness they felt. The men who had spent years on the frontier, who had faced starvation, fought off bandits, and survived the worst storms, had learned to accept the truth about food out here. Out here, the feast was never what it seemed. Jack leaned back against a log, his expression unreadable as he let the last spoonful of stew settle in his gut. He didn't speak at first, just looked at the stars, the cold night sky stretching above them. It wasn't the stars that held his gaze, though. It was the quiet understanding that had grown between them, here in the middle of the night. There was something deeper about Solomon's way of living, something that couldn't be taught in the usual way. For Jack, it had always been about getting through. Get what you can, take what's offered, and do what's necessary to survive. Solomon, however, never rushed things. He moved through life with the calm of a man who had nothing to prove to anyone. He didn't speak much, but when he did, it carried weight. And now, as the men sat around the fire, their stomachs full in a way they hadn't expected, they could see that there was more to survival than just holding on. "What you got in that stew, anyway?" Another man asked, leaning forward, his voice full of curiosity. "I've never tasted anything like it." Solomon took a slow breath before answering, his voice a quiet murmur that blended with the wind. "It's not just about what's in the pot," he said, his words hanging in the night air. "It's what you add to it, how you look at what you've got and how you make it work." The others stared at him for a moment, then looked down at their empty bowls. They had known what it was to make do, but Solomon had turned it into an art, turning a single rabbit into something that could sustain them, both physically and in spirit. One by one, the men rose from the fire and went to their tents or blankets, their movements slower now, calmer. The stew had filled their bellies, but it was the lesson that would stay with them. It wasn't the rabbit that had fed them, it was the way Solomon had fed them hope. The way he had shown them that even in the most difficult moments, survival didn't just come from strength, it came from patience, from knowing that a little went a long way when you knew how to use it. The fire was dying down, its embers casting a faint orange glow across the camp. The wind had shifted, and the night was colder now, a reminder that winter was coming and the days of warmth would soon be nothing more than a distant memory. But for the first time in days, the men didn't feel the cold as acutely. The warmth in their bellies from the stew still lingered, but it was more than just the food that kept them grounded. It was the quiet understanding that something had shifted between them. Solomon's calm presence, his patience, had given them something they hadn't realized they were missing: trust. Not just in him, but in themselves. The way he had prepared that single rabbit with such care, such thoughtfulness, had made them rethink their own approach to survival. They had always been men of action, quick to move, quick to act, never stopping to consider the bigger picture. But tonight, Solomon had shown them that survival wasn't just about fighting, it was about respecting the land, respecting the seasons, and respecting each other. As the men sat in the dying glow of the fire, they felt a shift. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't a grand gesture, but it was there, beneath the surface, in the way they looked at each other now. They no longer saw just a group of men trying to survive. They saw something more, an unspoken bond, forged in the firelight, made stronger by the shared experience of eating a simple meal, yet one that held meaning far beyond the food in itself. Jack, the old cowhand who had once questioned Solomon's methods, was the first to break the silence. He had always been a man of few words, but tonight he seemed to have found something in the quiet that he hadn't known was there. "You know," Jack said, his voice low but steady, "I've spent more winters than I care to remember out here. I thought I knew all there was to know about surviving the land, but you've taught me something tonight." Solomon didn't respond immediately. He simply nodded, his eyes meeting Jack's for a brief moment before turning back to the fire. There was nothing else to say. Solomon's way wasn't about teaching lessons through words, it was about living them. The others followed Jack's lead, each offering their own quiet acknowledgment, though none of them could put it into words as Jack had. It wasn't a moment of grand epiphany, but it was a moment of understanding. They had learned something vital. They had learned that survival wasn't just about scraping by. It was about living with intention, with patience, and with a respect for the land that would sustain them when nothing else could. As the fire flickered and the camp grew still, the men drifted to their blankets, their minds a little lighter, their hearts a little fuller. They had survived another night, but more importantly, they had learned what it meant to truly live through it.